Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the third Q&A session of the North East Cambridge Area Action Plan. My name is Terry D'Souza. I am a Principal Planning Policy Officer at the Greater Cambridge Shared Planning Service, and I'm going to be your host today for this session. I'm very pleased to say that we have a number of people joining us today on our panel who will hopefully be able to answer all your interesting and really relevant questions on water and climate change, which are very important and key topics, not only for North East Cambridge, but generally for Greater Cambridge overall. Before we get started, I just wanted to run through how the session is going to run today. So there's just going to be a quick introduction where everyone will introduce themselves. And I'll also set out some of the kind of housekeeping rules about how you can ask your questions and how the team will answer those. My co-host, Emma, will then do a short presentation on not only the area action plan, but provide some details as to what the kind of climate change and water policies say in the plan. And then it's over to you. And you have the opportunity to ask us questions. And as I said, we will do our best to answer those for you. Now, the way you do that is very simple. At the bottom of your screen, there will be a button that will say Q&A. Within that, you can type in your question, and you can do that either anonymously or you can put your name against that, and the team will then pick those up as the session goes on. Now, in previous sessions, we have run out of time to answer all of the questions. So what we've done previously is we will get through as many as we can within the hour. And then after that, any questions that we aren't able to answer live, we will then provide a written response to those and put those onto the council's website alongside a recording of this Q&A session. Now, the recording, it won't show any of the people that are there watching us. It's only going to be the panelists and myself that will be visible on the screen, so you don't need to worry about you being visible to the world. We won't be reading out any names either when we're answering your questions. So without further ado, I'm just going to now introduce my co-hosts and fellow panelists. So I'll first turn to Emma.
Okay, good afternoon. I'm Emma Davis. I'm the Principal Sustainability Consultant for the Greater Cambridge Shared Planning Service. So I'm here to provide a quick presentation and then ask any kind of climate change and sustainable construction specific questions that you might have.
Thank you, Emma. I will then now pass over to Julia. Oh, Julia, I think you're on mute, sorry.
Hi, sorry about that. My name is Julia Beaden. I work for the County Council. I'm the Flood Risk and Biodiversity Manager. And although I haven't been as directly involved, my team works across this project with a number of colleagues from the Greater Cambridgeshire Partnership. We're looking at the ecology and surface water flood risk impacts of this site going forwards.
Thank you, Julia. And Harry.
Good afternoon, my name is Harry Pickford. I work for the County Council as well as a Sustainable Drainage and Flood Risk Officer. It's kind of commenting on planning as it comes through the surface water impacts on this development.
Thank you, Harry, that's great. And Louisa?
Hi, I'm Louisa Nunes. I'm Drainage Engineer for Cambridge City Council. I've been involved giving advice to the planning team on flood risk sustainable drainage policy for this site.
Thank you. And Matthew?
Hi, I'm Matthew Patterson. I'm the project lead developing the North East Cambridge Area Action Plan on behalf of the Shared Planning Service.
Great. Thank you, Matt. So people who will be watching will also see my colleagues Joe and Hannah on the screen. Joe and Hannah are providing invaluable technical support with this Q&A and others. So just in case you're wondering who they were. Okay, I should also say that there's no chat facility within the webinar. It is just a Q&A session. So as I said, please feel free to ask questions. You can do so any point from now on. And we will start, I think, with the presentation. So Emma, if you'd be able to run through the presentation, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, of course, thank you. Just wait for the screen to start sharing. Oh, there we go. Okay, so welcome all to this Q&A session where we are focusing on climate change and water for you today. So if we move on to the next slide, just going to give you a very brief overview of the site. So we're looking at 180-ish hectares of brownfield land in an area of the city that's got good transport accessibility already and which will improve significantly over the coming decades. The site is a 15-minute cycle ride from the city centre, and we've got a range of landowners on the site, which is one of the reasons why we are looking to produce a coordinated planning framework for the site. The site is also strategically important, not just for the Greater Cambridge area, so Cambridge and South Cambridgeshire, but also for the wider region, which includes the Oxford-Cambridge arc. But what we're very clear on is that the development of this site must also benefit local communities. So it needs to address deprivation and also ensure integration. So the next slide will take you through what is an area action plan. So basically, it's a planning framework to guide the development of a specific area, and it has equivalent status to a local plan. So the document will set out the spatial framework for how the development will come forward, and it sets out a range of thematic policies. It's supported by a very extensive evidence base, so there are various studies and also topic papers, and it will go through an examination process with an independent planning inspector prior to its adoption. So moving on next now to our vision for the site. So we really want North East Cambridge to be an inclusive, walkable, low carbon new city district with a lively mix of homes, workplaces, services and social spaces, which is fully integrated with surrounding neighbourhoods. So the next slide will take you through just some of the headline figures for the site. So at the moment, the site, it's 182 hectares of land. There's 15,000 jobs currently on the site and just 3 homes. There are also 4,400 unused car parking spaces on the site. And as we've already mentioned, it's 15 minutes from the city centre by bike. In the future, what we're looking at is around 8,000 new homes on the site for around 18,000 residents, and 40% of those homes will be affordable. We're looking at 20,000 new jobs being created across the site in many different sectors. And also we're looking at the creation of 10 hectares of public parks and squares. There'll be 3 new primary schools for the site, a new library, and we'll be looking at around 10 new or improved walking and cycling connections with the rest of the city and surrounding area. So next slide really, and now focusing in on the purpose of today's session, which is climate change and water. I don't think you need to start with the site itself. It is a highly sustainable location for low carbon living. And through the Area Action Plan, we're going to ensure that new development takes a holistic approach to designing for both climate change mitigation, which is reducing emissions, and also adaptation, so making sure that the site is resilient to future climate change. The development of the site will also have to support the transition to net zero carbon. Now, if you've already looked at the Area Action Plan, there's no specific carbon reduction targets in there yet. And that is because we're actually working at the moment on a piece of evidence base that will develop those carbon reduction targets, not just for the Area Action Plan, but actually for Greater Cambridge as a whole. And we've got the local plan happening kind of in parallel to this process. We are also going to be developing an energy master plan for the site. So that's a document that will identify the energy systems required to support those carbon reduction targets and also the infrastructure required to facilitate their delivery. And also we're working on a water cycle study that's being developed, which is looking at both flood risk and also water resource availability and water infrastructure. And that's a document that we're going to have independently peer reviewed by a specialist in this sector. So moving on to my next slide, as I've already mentioned, this is a really good site for low carbon living. It's a site that already benefits from good sustainable transport links. So we've got Cambridge North Station, there's the bus route, and we've already got some good cycle links on the site, all of which will be improved. The Area Action Plan really focuses in on the creation of compact, livable and walkable communities. It's making use of an existing brownfield site rather than a greenfield site. So what this allows for is a higher density development and also a mixed use development, meaning that the development will be more walkable and it will be more energy efficient than you would get with a lower density development. Next slide is really some of what's key in all of this is the opportunity that this site presents for low carbon travel, and it presents an opportunity for a major shift in travel behaviour. So we're very clear that the car will not be king on this site. The site is going to be designed for walking, cycling and public transport to make active travel the natural and obvious choice for people living and working on this site. There are a number of ways in which we can discourage non-essential car use. So for example, thinking about quotas and also parking restrictions. And one of the clear benefits of this is that we'll actually see an improvement in air quality and well-being benefits for everyone who's currently affected by the levels of transport on Milton Road. So next slide is, this is kind of a slide that's showing you some of the opportunities on this site for designing for the climate emergency. So policy 2 of the Area Action Plan is our climate emergency policy. And this diagram here sets out some of the opportunities to integrate climate resilience into the design of the built environment. So looking at things like enhancing green infrastructure through planting trees, through using green and brown roofs, all of which helps to keep buildings, streets and spaces cool. We're looking at requiring external shading and overhangs on buildings to help reduce overheating. And we're also talking about things like using cool materials and also looking at integrating water and sustainable drainage systems into open spaces. And then the next slide, which is my last slide before I hand back to Terry, is some of the water issues. Now we know that water is a very sensitive issue for kind of Greater Cambridge as a whole. The Area Action Plan sets out a number of policies on water. There's a water efficiency policy in there. Now, some of you may know that we are slightly hampered in the water efficiency standards that we can require of new development because government have actually restricted us to only be able to set a certain level of water efficiency from new housing development. But we are looking to introduce policy in the Area Action Plan that will encourage and incentivise developers to do better. We've also got policy in there requiring the use of sustainable drainage systems, which are systems that are integrated into buildings and into landscapes to slow the flow of floodwater, but also deliver other multiple benefits, including biodiversity enhancement and also amenity benefits. To inform policy, as already mentioned, we're working on an integrated water management study, and this will identify what water resources are available for the future growth and will also help to identify what infrastructure in terms of water supply and also wastewater will be needed. And I think that's it from me, so I'll hand back to Terry briefly.
Thank you, Emma, that was really helpful. So before we get started, we had a few questions come through kind of on social media and things what people have been asking. So we thought we'd put them into the beginning of the Q&A session just to try and address some of those questions. So we've got various members of the team that are going to go through these questions. So the first question that we have is, how will the scheme deal with flood risk? I'm going to pass over to my colleagues who will pick that up.
I can answer this one. So the development proposals will require a strategic flood risk assessment. And the strategic flood risk assessment is being carried out for Cambridge City Council and South Cambridgeshire. And of course, the Northeast Cambridge is included in this area. The study is going to look into assessing flood risk from different sources and looking at the effects of climate change. This study will be available, is being carried out by a consultant, Stantec, and we are aiming to have a draft in September. There is also some stakeholders involved: Environment Agency, Lead Local Flood Authority, water companies. And as the individual development proposals come forward for the Northeast Cambridge, we can then identify which sites are within the flood risk zones. And if the site, a specific site is in the flood risk zone, there will be a need of a specific flood risk assessment for that development. There will be also, to minimize the flood risk, there will be also implementation of sustainable drainage measures for all sites, even without being in the flood risk zone. Those standards and expectations for the sustainable drainage are drafts in the policy for sea flood risk and sustainable drainage. I think that's it.
That's great, thank you, Louisa. Okay, then we have another question, and this will be going to, sorry, Julia, and will there be enough water for the proposed development?
Hi, okay, so there's three effective levels of this question to tackle. There's the local level in terms of the building design and the development design. There's then what's happening as part of the local plan and what's happening on a more regional basis at which the water companies work. So first of all, in terms of the development itself, what a large number of different regulators and stakeholders are obviously either involved in or in a role whereby they'll be approving these designs. So there's a lot of very close working from the local level right up to the more regional level with the water companies and with the developers. And it is going to be an area where everything is managed very, very carefully. There's very significant awareness of the local concern around water resources. So everyone's working very closely together, and developers will be expected to demonstrate that all proposed development will be served by an adequate water supply. So in terms of the development itself, buildings will be designed to reduce water by over 15% compared to the current average for Cambridge. The proposal is also that the new development must achieve, as a minimum, water efficiency, which is equivalent to 110 litres per person per day. There will also be, as Emma mentioned, a desire for mains water consumption of actually 80 litres per person per day to be achieved. And this, we hope, can be achieved using rainwater harvesting and various other methods of water recycling. So weight will be afforded to trying to encourage that to happen. As Emma mentioned, there is that limitation from government, unfortunately. So proposals for non-residential development must also achieve 5 BREEAM credits for water use, that's policy WAT01, unless it can be demonstrated that that really is not economically or technically viable. So that's what we're looking for, 5 BREEAM credits for water use. So in terms of the local plan at the next level for all the developments, as Louisa mentioned, the consultants Stantec have been appointed to carry out a strategic flood risk assessment. They're also carrying out an integrated water management study. And the point of this is to provide a robust evidence base for the local plan to support that plan's development. And this includes looking at the NEC Area Action Plan site. So the aim of the study is to look at all aspects of the water environment, to consider the sustainability of the growth that is being proposed and what water infrastructure will be required, and then to work out what measures are needed to manage and protect the water environment. So it's very much a case of, as I said, looking at all of that growth and working out what is needed in partnership with the water companies, so Cambridge Water and Anglian Water, to make sure that that infrastructure is going to be able to be provided. The study will identify what water resources are available for future growth, and then will help the councils looking at different possible growth scenarios. The water resources element of the study is also going to be independently reviewed by a national recognised expert in this field to ensure rigorous scrutiny. So as Emma mentioned earlier, that's the peer review. So the consultation encourages comment and feedback on policies 4A, which is water efficiency, and 4B, which is water quality, and ensuring a supply for the draft Area Action Plan. So then just briefly at the wider scale, many of you may be aware of water resource management plans. These are water company plans that plan for 25 years, and these are updated every 5 years. And the current one for Cambridge Water is 2020 to 2045. And at that much more regional level, the water companies are working together to try and work out how they are going to provide water resources for the future. And this is looking at much broader scale measures around whether the county needs more reservoirs, how they can reduce abstraction from groundwater and therefore provide greater resilience for our chalk streams. It's also going to be looking at water transfer with other regions. And in order to do this in the best possible way, what's happened is a lot of the water companies in the region have clubbed together to create Water Resources East, which was also mentioned earlier. And through that organisation, they will be developing some quite broad-ranging and hopefully quite innovative solutions to tackle this for the long term, so that work can underpin any kind of growth in the local plan. Okay, that's all from me. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Julia. Okay, and then the next question we have is how does the draft area action plan help address climate change? And I think Emma will be able to help with that.
Okay, so section 4.1 of the draft area action plan sets out designing for the climate emergency. So in terms of addressing climate change, and I'm going to focus in a little bit here on kind of climate change adaptation, is that policy will require all development to be climate proofed against a range of different climate risks. So this includes flood risk and water availability that Julia's already touched on, and Louisa, and also risks such as overheating, which is becoming quite a critical area that we're experiencing. So in order to minimise the risk of overheating, for example, the Area Action Plan requires all development to apply what is known as the cooling hierarchy. So this is looking at ways to reduce the amount of heat entering buildings, primarily using energy efficient design, using measures to reduce heating, such as reduce heat entering buildings, such as looking at orientation of buildings, the amount of fenestration, but also looking at things like shading, the use of cool materials, green roofs, and wider green infrastructure. And it's looking at those kind of passive design measures before we then start to think about having to use mechanical means of ventilation, with air conditioning being the absolute last resort. We're also going to require all development to undertake overheating analysis using kind of industry guidance. And we're asking them to do that using future climate scenarios as well, under a 2050 climate scenario. And also when designing for overheating risk, they also need to take account of the external environment and any constraints that there might be. So thinking about noise, air quality, and that sort of thing. So I think that's probably enough for that for now.
Thank you, Emma. Okay, and then the final question before we get on to the questions that are coming in at the moment. Well, this is a good question, because you know, the draft area action plan talks about how this will be a green development and very sustainable, but will this development actually be net zero carbon? So Matt, hopefully you'll be able to answer that question for us.
Thanks, Terry. Yeah, so yes, the draft North East Area Action Plan has been fundamentally shaped really by the requirement for it to be low carbon, low impact, and to meet our requirements regarding net biodiversity increase. So therefore, development at North Cambridge must support the transition towards net zero carbon society. And in that context, development must minimise carbon emissions associated with the operational energy and construction, including materials, as well as wider emissions, for example, those associated with transport. Development has to be supported by decentralised energy, low carbon energy, combined with smart approaches to energy infrastructure, including energy storage, which is policy 3. Achieving net zero carbon requires us to rethink all aspects of planning and placemaking, not just about how the buildings are designed and constructed, but also about siting development where it will be well served by public transport, cycling and walking, as well as renewable and low carbon energy. Proposals should be future-proofed as well to enable future occupants to easily retrofit and upgrade buildings and or infrastructure in the future to enable achievement of a net zero carbon development. We're currently working with Bioregional to develop an evidence base for net zero carbon policies in the local plan, and we'll use those to define targets and policies for inclusion in both the AAP but also in the local plan. And that work's not just looking at energy use in buildings, but also issues like transport and embodied carbon, as well as when development should achieve net zero carbon. So for now, we have a placeholder in policy 2 in the AAP, and that's where we're at.
Great, thank you, Matt. Okay, so 2 of the questions that we've had through so far, I think I'm going to try and group them together and probably send them over to your way, Emma. So many moons ago, I attended a presentation at then Newhall College on water management strategy for the area, what happened, and the Environment Agency have written a letter on the 7th of August saying they determined that current levels of abstraction are causing environmental damage. Any increase in use within existing licence volumes will increase the pressure on a system that is already failing environmental targets. How do you reconcile development with an acknowledged lack of water resource? Now, I think Julia probably picked this up a little bit in her response, but Emma, it'd be good if you could just touch on those a little bit, please. That'd be great.
Yeah, okay, so I think the first question, I think that actually relates to the water cycle study that was produced to support our existing local plans, which was produced by, I think it was Halcro. I think the date on that document is 2011, something like that. So that was a document that informed policy development for our existing local plans. Now, that document did actually recommend, in terms of water efficiency, a figure of 80 litres per person per day, which is the policy that we had in our draft local plan. And unfortunately, that policy was removed from the local plan by the planning inspector. This links back to what I mentioned earlier about us being restricted in the policies that we can set. So that is an issue for us moving forward, and something that we are looking at as part of the new kind of integrated water management study that we've already referenced and that Julia has referenced. The Environment Agency, I believe, are on the steering group for that particular study. So we are working very, very closely with the Environment Agency, the water companies, and also other groups involved in the water environment, because we do know that this is a critical issue that needs to be addressed across all sectors, not just new development, but every area of water use really does need to consider how we can reduce water demand so that we have long-term sustainable supplies of water resources. So that is something that is being looked at in great detail as part of the integrated water management study, and looking at, you know, what can we do to perhaps go further than we are currently able to in local policy. Conversely, we can set whatever water efficiency standard that we can for non-residential development. So the standard that Julia referenced, which is the maximum credits from the BREEAM certification process, that is the highest standard of water efficiency that you can actually get from non-residential development. So it is a key issue moving forward, and one that we are looking at with our various partners as part of the integrated water management policy, and also considering what we can do in terms of lobbying for powers to set more stringent water efficiency standards.
Okay, thank you. And then there's a follow-up question to that, which is about the timescales for new water resource are far longer than the time frame for development. Julia, is that something you might be able to pick up on?
Fine. So yes, that is true in terms of if the solution is to develop a new reservoir, for example, that is obviously a very long-term plan. So that's why the water resource management plans are planned for 25 years. But you're right, in the short term, that's why it's imperative that the development does consider to take as much action as it can, and the things that Emma and I have mentioned in terms of reduced water usage. But if you look in the water resource management plans for Cambridge Water and Anglian Water, it's reassuring to know that they are working together, and that these issues, and there's nothing new for those water companies. The Environment Agency and has been making the water companies aware of this concern for a while, and the partners are working very closely together to try and look at solutions. So there are proposals to try and look at some quite short-term solutions to improve the resilience of the chalk streams. So I think you'll hear over the next kind of year, the next probably 6 months or so, the water company through Water Resources East looking to try and create some local projects working with local partners like the catchment partners and with the district councils and others and local landowners to try and work out what they can do on a short-term basis. And I think the priority is very much about that resilience for chalk streams, because everyone is aware it's not just about the water resource levels, but about when that water is abstracted from the chalk streams, the impact that then has on the habitat and the biodiversity of those streams. So it is very much an issue that people are aware of, and I think the public pressure, you know, has to a certain extent been a really good thing, because it has meant that issue really stays at the top of that agenda. And I think there's definitely going to be some movement over the next few months as we start to look at you know, how we can take some of those projects forward in the short term, so that then there's methods in place so that the long-term schemes can then pick up from there. There's certainly been a discussion with the county council, with South Cambs and with some farmers in some of the catchments about whether we can get together and start a project. So that's something that we're all quite excited about doing, and very much watch this space.
Sounds good. Thank you, Julia. Okay, we've got another question. One of the previous slides had somebody holding a carrot, which I think sparked the question. So what provision will this development make for residents growing food, which is a key element of a low carbon community? We need dedicated facilities, including allotments and community gardens. So that's a really good question. So Matt, is that something you could take on, please?
Yeah, sure. So a key requirement of the AAP is to require the master planning of the area to be landscape led, and it's purposely done so. And the open space environment within NEC has to work really hard. It has to deliver on the biodiversity agenda, our walking and cycling agenda. It has to deal with the climate change as well in terms of trees and planting for cool. But alongside that, the amenity spaces that are provided are there for recreation purposes, for proper amenity purposes, but can also be providing for community gardens, allotments. In particular, we're looking at green roofs, which are equally able to cater for community gardens and the like. And part of this will come down to the planting strategy of the landscaping proposals as well. What we're looking for there is things like community orchards as part of those landscape strategies, and making provision for growing.
Thank you, Matt. I know some of the community orchards in the city at the moment are extremely popular, aren't they, for local communities? So, yeah, definitely something that we'll be looking to build on, really, for North East Cambridge.
Yeah, and you can build a lot of that into the landscape strategy that you put in place. You know, a landscape doesn't necessarily just need to be, nice trees and things like that, but they can be functional as well in terms of herb planting and other types of planting that can deliver on that.
Absolutely, thank you. Okay, so we've got a question about, it's quite relevant actually, as soon as the weather we've been having recently. So St. Neots was hit by flash flooding not so long ago. How will you deal with this now, now that we've got this raised risk, especially during the summer? So is that something, Louisa, you might be able to answer, please?
So with the climate change, we will see that the rainfall will be quite frequent, and like flash floodings will appear more in the summer. So in terms of the design, we expect the sustainable drainage to accommodate the climate change allowance, to prevent, to accommodate the rainfall, this intensive rainfall. I know if Julia and Ari, do you have anything to add?
Should I come in? So yeah, as Louisa mentioned, there's obviously work that needs to be done at the site detail, and that's what Louisa and Harry will review in detail as the applications come forward, but very much along the lines that Emma's mentioned around sustainable drainage systems, holding back that water so that it doesn't have an impact downstream, and then obviously wherever possible providing betterment. But just for the wider context, there is a growing obviously concern across the country about flash flooding. This is what we call surface water flooding, or you may hear it referred to as pluvial flooding. And the Environment Agency has just released its new national strategy. So it's the National Flood and Coastal Erosion Risk Management Strategy that was just released for public awareness last week, as that's sorry, week before last, I think, as that's now going through Parliament for approval. And that recognises the increasing risk of all sorts of flood risk, as Louisa mentioned, through climate change. But for surface water, that's an area that that my team at the County Council and also Louisa's team are very, very aware of. And the County Council have a duty to prepare a local flood risk management strategy, which we will update now that the national strategy has been approved. We look very much to try and work with existing communities that have that risk, to see what we can put in place with them to manage the risk better. And I think one of the difficult things, as Louisa mentioned, because climate change is going to have a significant risk, is balancing that against the infrastructure that we have in this country at the moment, because the types of rainfall that we're seeing, and we haven't got the figures yet, but I suspect for St Neots will prove that the drainage itself, in terms of the existing highway drainage, probably had a very minimal effect on the rain, because I suspect the rainfall was so heavy that it was of much greater quantity than could be coped with by any highway or local infrastructure on that scale. And what that means is that for all of us across the country, we're going to have to be much better prepared for this kind of rainfall. Obviously, in terms of replacing huge swathes of infrastructure, that's a massive project and will take time and cost money. So we're all going to have to be much more prepared. And while the emphasis is on the individual landowners to manage the risk to their property, and that involves things like working community to do community flood plans and personal flood plans, we want very much to work with you, with the water companies like Anglian Water, with the Environment Agency, and across the district and council partners, and also internal drainage boards where they exist in the area, to try and find solutions that we can take this forward. What I would do though is just say, if we do have any flash flooding in any of the areas, just to urge you to report that, because the County Council can only take forward projects and investigations about areas where it's aware that internal flooding to properties has happened. So just to put a general plea out there for anyone that is aware of flooding to internal properties, to please report that to the County Council, so that we can then look to make improvements. But I think the focus here is very much on the site. We've got a new development and we've got that opportunity to make sure that site does have a really fantastic drainage strategy, and incorporates things like green roofs and fantastic sustainable drainage systems that do not only reduce the risk, not only prevent there being an increase in risk, but also reduce that risk and provide betterment to the current situation.
Thank you, Julia. We were talking earlier actually about when there is flash flooding and who that gets reported to, and how there's a bit of ambiguity out there as to who do you contact? You contact the council or the fire brigade or others. So it's helpful that you added that in there, because I don't think people really know, because I don't think they come across it very often. So I think it's quite good to know that if it does happen, then
situation as well. It's something that I don't think any of us would have chosen for government to give us this this messy picture. With having water companies, district councils, county councils, highways, internal drainage boards, Environment Agency, everyone has a different role in flooding, and I think that's incredibly confusing for the public and not something that any of us would wish on it. So I'd always say they're very welcome to report the flooding to us as the lead local flood authority, and we can make sure that the right people then dealing with those reports.
Thank you. I've got some more questions about allotments, but before that, I'm just going to stick to the water theme for just a second for one more question. It said, will some of that water be collected to water the green spaces within North East Cambridge? So, Emma, you're nodding your head, so that might be a question that might be coming your way.
Yeah, that's quite a common approach actually in a lot of schemes that come forward, and it's something that our landscape architects will often look at is what is the strategy for actually watering open spaces, and they will establish much more successfully if they are actually watered with rainwater. So I would say it's something that we will be looking for in terms of the long-term management and maintenance of those open spaces.
Yeah, and I know in the actual area action plan itself, it talks about sort of drought resilient landscaping as well, to make sure that we're not increasing the problem in terms of water usage, and trying to make sure that the landscapes and sort of public realm are resilient to the changing weather patterns that we're seeing at the moment. So yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Okay, coming back onto the allotment question, which seems to be a popular one. So there's some skepticism, Matt, about green roofs and whether that will provide the allotments that people are going to need, and also talking about how within parishes there's a real requirement that new homes provide allotments. So what does the city council say in terms of its sort of planning obligations or planning requirements on allotments, and how will that be picked up as, I suppose, as part of the North East Cambridge development as sites come forward?
Yeah, so I can deal with the first one. Green roofs are only part. They're potentially a small part of what we're talking about in terms of space for growing food. Really, what we're talking about is within the wider open space and amenity space that's provided within the scheme's landscape surrounds. But roof gardens can provide a component of that as well. In terms of allotments themselves, the local plan standard is a requirement of 0.4 hectares per 1,000 head of population. We are looking towards meeting that, but it may be that that is better met rather than through allotments, through community garden space that more people can then obviously access and share, and looking at joining those with schools and things so that the children get involved in growing and understanding how plants grow early in.
Right, I'm on mute there. Yeah, and then just a follow-up question I think on that was about talking about the standards, which I think you've already mentioned, Matt. Recognising that North East Cambridge isn't, it's not an urban extension, but it clearly needs significant provision given the absence of allotments in nearby Orchard Park, and what growing areas on the ground will there be? I think you've sort of covered that a bit in your response already.
Yeah, hopefully. I mean, we've got the allotments next door to the site that are already there. We would be looking to make complementary provision on site, but like I say, I think whether it's allotments in the traditional sense or whether you're looking at more community garden growing areas.
Cool, thank you. Okay, but I think that's a really good point actually, and I think if with all of the things that we're talking about today and others, if people have real strong kind of views and thoughts on these topics, then we would we really encourage you to firstly thank you for taking part in the Q&A, but to actually put in your comments formally through the consultation process, because that is really how we're going to be able to understand what the concerns are of local people, and how we can then try and address those as we seek to finalise the plan over the next months and years before it gets adopted. So yeah, just a plug really to the consultation, just to make sure you get your comments in writing. That would be really good. Okay, so moving away from water and allotments now, going on to construction materials. So what requirement is being placed on developers to use low carbon construction materials to limit embedded carbon? That sounds like an Emma question.
That does sound like an Emma question. Okay, so this is quite an interesting area actually, and it is quite a critical area for net zero carbon, because dealing with energy use in buildings is actually quite easy to do, and the embodied carbon in materials is quite a big proportion of a building's energy use. Now, it is an emerging area because at the moment in the UK, there's no one defined way of actually calculating embodied carbon. So what we've done for now is it's a kind of placeholder that we've put into policy 2 of the Area Action Plan. So we will be requiring all developers to minimise carbon emissions associated with embodied carbon, and we are asking them to use a specific way of calculating that, and I think we refer them to what's in I think it's the RICS embodied carbon or climate emergency design guide. So that's what we're using for now, because that's kind of one of the established methodologies, but I think there's a lot of work still to be done on actually defining a really good tool for calculating embodied carbon, and it's something that Bioregional are looking at for us as part of their work on net zero carbon. So when we've got the outputs for that study, which should be later this year, we can re-look at that part of the policy, and if we need to slightly amend that policy, we can do. But yeah, we are certainly wanting all development to be calculating and limiting the amount of embodied carbon in materials used.
Sorry, I'm on mute. Follow-up question to that. Can you insist that RICS or Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors standards are met?
It's a very good question. I think we can only try. As far as I'm aware at the moment, there aren't any other local plans adopted that have got embodied carbon policy requirements. So it is an area that I would say we're possibly testing through the area action plan and also through the local plan. But the RICS targets are quite widely used already in the construction industry. So I would hope a lot of the developers that we will see on site will already be quite familiar, which is why we went for the RICS approach for now, because it's probably the most familiar approach to the widest part of the construction industry.
Okay. And then one of the questions that I was actually asked on the first webinar, and I thought it was probably more appropriate for this one, was about timber framed buildings and about what sort of, there's a big push at the moment, I think centrally from government about, looking at other methods of construction. And timber is obviously one that is getting a lot of international attention. And just, what role could timber frame buildings have at North East Cambridge, and how does that help, if at all, in terms of, carbon reduction and sustainable construction in general, really?
Yeah, so yeah, there's nothing in the area action plan to prevent timber frame construction being used, and it's already quite a popular approach, certainly in residential development. You see the use of a lot of timber in modular construction, for example, and cross-laminated timber, which is a very kind of strong structural type of timber, is becoming more and more widespread. So some of that would get picked up in that kind of embodied carbon approach. The area action plan does require kind of life cycle analysis as well. So there is a bit of debate amongst architects as to what is a better performing material when you look at life cycle and take into account things like, if you're using concrete frame, that might give you slightly better thermal mass and helps to cool the building, reducing cooling loads. So there is a bit of a kind of argument about what's the best technique, but I think certainly we may well see more timber construction for some of the buildings coming forward. It becomes slightly trickier when you get to slightly taller buildings, because building regulations requirements kick in as well, and they will sometimes limit the use of timber for structural elements. But I think certainly we'll see it coming forwards more and more.
Thank you. Sorry, I keep forgetting to unmute. Thank you. Right, we've got 10 more minutes in this Q&A. So if there's any more questions people like to ask, please do ask them in the Q&A function at the bottom. Like I said, if we don't manage to get through them all, we will provide written responses and put those online within the next couple of days. Just to give you just a quick update in terms of what's coming up moving forward, we do have it's got 5 on there, 5 more Q&A sessions lined up. The next one is on open spaces and biodiversity, that's on the 26th. And then, as you can see, we have a few more themed sessions before we have a more general one to conclude on the 21st of September, which is just a couple of weeks before the consultation closes, which the date for the diaries is 5 p.m. on the 5th of October. So if you are going to respond to the consultation, please make sure your comments are with us by then. And there's a lot more detail on the website, on the council's website, as to how you can engage in the process. Details on the screen now. Okay, so before we run out of time, we've got some questions here. Okay, so we've got one about, okay, for amusement. Note that timber was used for the framework of the roof at York Minster after it burnt back in the 80s. I would have thought that was a tall building. Fair enough. Okay, and we've got one here about basements. Okay, so it's very often deep basements and underground car parks require more concrete and embody more carbon. Will you refuse permission for these? Oh, that's a really good question, actually. So, Emma, is that something you might be able to help with, or is it a Matt question?
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure what the response is, because we do actually see quite a lot of basements, and they're used for multiple uses. So they do provide basement parking. They also provide plant space. But undoubtedly they do have quite a high embodied carbon requirement. So I think some of the work that's ongoing, looking at targets for embodied carbon, might help with some of that. There are some benefits when you're digging a basement, though, in that you could actually be at the same time thinking about putting in ground source heat pumps. So there are possibly some advantages with that approach. I think in terms of the car parking, obviously the standards within the area action plan will hopefully be reducing the amount of car parking spaces anyway. But yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I think with more work done on embodied carbon and coming up with actual targets for that, that would hopefully help to limit some of that. Yeah,
just to add, I don't think we're really looking at underground basement car parking at NEC. The proposal here is to look at car barns more than anything else, so it's car storage, and we're looking at those as sort of multi-storey car parks more than underground basement parking within buildings. And then even then they'd be wrapped around, if you like, with other uses around them. But as Emma says, if there are basements going in, certainly could be for any purposes really, cycle storage and other things. You could look at how the other benefits that could be delivered from those as well, in terms of heat source pumps.
I think you ended on the right word, because the next question was, are heat pumps part of the planning process, I think.
You want me to pick up on that one?
Yeah, you can go for it.
I suspect we will see a shift to heat pumps. We're already seeing quite a shift towards heat pumps in applications coming forward now. That's partly linked to government's proposals to ban new gas boilers in new homes from 2025, and certainly most commercial developments or non-residential developments coming forwards now are either using ground source or air source heat pumps. That is one of the things that we will be looking at as part of the Energy Master Plan work, as well as what sort of technologies are there out there to help support the targets that will be in the Area Action Plan. So I think we may well be seeing a bit of a mix of technologies really, but I think certainly we will be moving towards electric forms of heating for this site. And you could see possibly district scale heat networks powered by heat pumps. I don't want to preempt the work, but certainly this development is of a scale that that sort of approach could be possible.
And a follow-up question to that then, Emma, is, so you talk about the Energy Master Plan, and it was in the presentation at the beginning, but what happens if a developer or a landowner doesn't want to sign up to the Energy Master Plan for the site? Would you have a gap? Would they kind of be allowed to do their own thing? How would that work?
They would need to provide justification as to why they couldn't sign up to the Energy Master Plan. I mean, that Energy Master Plan is going to be subject to viability testing, as well as being a technical piece of work. So I think, any proposals to move away from that Energy Master Plan, which will be required through policy, there will need to be some quite detailed justification as to why it cannot be implemented for a particular site. I mean, the whole idea is to try and take a more efficient approach to energy across the whole site, and to also integrate that with utilities infrastructure as well. So anything that kind of goes outside of the master plan, it could be that there isn't sufficient infrastructure to support that approach anyway. So hopefully if we can work with landowners and bring them on board with this Energy Master Plan as well, it will get delivered and will deliver a much more appropriate response for a development of this scale.
Great, thank you, Emma. Okay, we've just got a couple of more minutes left. One question that really came through, particularly from councillors actually during before we were, when we were seeking authority to consult, was about whether we're setting a high enough standard for new homes and workplaces in relation to kind of carbon standards, or should we be doing more? Matt or Emma, I suspect they're probably questions for either of you. I think those are really
I mean, it's a good challenge by members, and I think it's right to challenge it and to push the targets as far as we can. we are slightly hampered in that we were hoping such targets would come from national and be led by national planning policy, and rather, unfortunately, the NPPF and others have gone slightly the other way in terms of, we were ramping up to Code for Sustainable Homes 6 at one point, and then we were going to be net zero carbon by 2025 or 2030, I think it was originally. And those targets have slowly gone away, really, and it's been left to the local authorities to try and forge ahead and try and deliver on the aspirations that I think we all want to see, which is to drive towards net zero carbon, but at a time when potentially, the government's priority is around building beautiful, but building lots and lots of homes, and probably at a cheaper level than we would want, and at a lower quality of standard than we would expect, I think, well, and want through policy, certainly. So I think it's right that we are certainly trying through the AAP to push the boundaries of what is achievable, and we're doing that in essence through doing an AAP for what is a large area, which enables us to do this at scale, so that when we come to the individual development plot, hopefully it's a much easier ask of the developer to deliver that if we've got the wider infrastructure put in place to help them achieve net zero carbon from the outset.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that Matt has said. We do encourage the use of other standards as well. So I know members are particularly keen on things like Passive House. So we do encourage the use of that through the area action plan. And I think also one of the things that the bioregional work is looking at is how to express standards and how to, is carbon reduction the right approach, or should we be looking at kind of energy intensity metrics, which really drives down energy demand in buildings. So it's quite a new area for us, and I would say we are going much further than we've ever done before in policy. So but yeah, I think we need to be challenged on these things, as Matt has said. Absolutely.
Brilliant. Thank you, Emma. Okay, that pretty much draws us to the end of the time. I just want to say thank you to the person who shared a link about how you can report flooding from the central government website, so that's really helpful, so thank you. I think we can actually put that in the in our written response that goes with the this video online, so that if anyone's watching this on demand, so to speak, then they can see where that is. So that would be really helpful, so thank you. Okay, so thank you very much to everybody who has joined us today. I hope we answered your questions kind of as fully and comprehensively as you were hoping. This is a big development, very exciting, but doesn't come without its challenges. Climate change and water is definitely one of those. So, we're really keen for you to provide us with your feedback on the draft plan. Are we doing enough? Should we be asking developers for more? So please do provide your feedback before the consultation deadline. There's a lot more information on our website. There's FAQ videos about the plan in general and some specific topics as well. And there's also a feedback form on the Q&A session. So if you have any comments or you want to tell us how you thought that the event went today or previous sessions have gone, then we would really welcome that. These are new to us. We've never done webinars before as a local planning authority. This is strange times that we're living in, but we are hoping that these sessions are helpful and useful to you. They're not quite the same as speaking to you all in public places face to face, but I think given where we are at the moment, these are hopefully a good alternative option. But yes, and just to say thank you very much for joining us, and also to my co-presenter Emma and all of the other panelists as well for taking the time today to be here. So thank you very much. Goodbye.